Excuse me. Hi, good morning, everyone. Um, well, time flies. Hello, hello, Vanisha. Hi, Trent. Um, it's really lovely to see you guys online saying hi. Um, hopefully the video quality is good. Sorry, I keep looking up because that's where all the all the second screen is seeing looking at what is going on virtually. Um, okay. Now we have a lot to cover this week, so I'm going to do a very quick skip through um, into a recap, and then even in my recap, I'm really going to be very targeted as to what I'm going to be showing. So you see me skipping slides, so please don't be too worried, because what I want to do as a recap will lead on into what we're going to be talking about today. Let's look at the slides from where we stopped last week. Unfortunately, I did annotate. I think I've only realized that I used the wrong slides to annotate for the live lecture. So you wouldn't have seen the ABCDE that is on the slide. But I didn't really want to change it too much, because ultimately what we're going to be talking about, we're going to do the same things again. Now, one of the key things I want you to take away from the last lecture that we will bring into this week is that you need to make sure you understand the concept of consumer and producer surplus. So when we look at um, the graph, and initially we would have all of this being yellow, and I consistently use yellow to indicate consumer surplus, and I consistently use green to indicate producer surplus, and the intersection of that is your equilibrium point. Okay, equilibrium point. Now, the people on the top now, okay, let's go back one step. So in this particular example, your equilibrium point is at $3, but when we are increasing the price, our price increase to P1, and that price increase will mean that, I'm trying to find a color that will show, will that increase in price, this increase in price will then show on your demand curve and on your supply curve, and that will give you the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. Now, we know that quantity supply here is greater than quantity demand, and that we have excess supply. That top bit, this top bit here that I am drawing on, those are the people with the high willingness to pay, or a high reservation price. And so they're going to be the ones that will purchase. I draw it on the demand curve because that portion of the demand curve shows the consumers that are that have a high reservation price or willingness to pay. Now, it's the consumer surplus is shown in the area below, but the demand on its own is represented on the demand curve. The suppliers that has a that are willing to produce are at the bottom. They are the ones, try to find the color, they're the ones here. So we are going to produce at this line, which I drew with a black pen before. So we're going to take the quantity demand, and we're going to be supplying at that point. So this is the point where I start to put letters, and this will be helpful for this week's content. So we're going to label this area A, B, C, D, and E. And as of today, we're going to see the changes, and we're going to describe the changes based on the letters. So for example, before um, before the price increase, our consumer surplus at at price $3, the consumer surplus was area A plus B plus C, and our producer surplus was D plus E. Whereas when we increase our price and we are going to produce our consumer surplus, it's now the area below the demand curve and above the price, then our area is shaded here in orange. And so instead of it being area A, B, and C, now the consumer surplus has shrunk to area A. The producer surplus, on the other hand, when price has increased, they are willing to sell at this higher price. And what we're going to see as a producer surplus is the area above the supply curve, but below the price. So our producer surplus is now the area mimicked by, represented by area B plus D. Okay, so this is very important, and we're going to continue today talking about price ceiling and price floor and taxation, basically encompassing what government intervention, and we're going to describe the areas C and E and talk about what they are as well. Okay, I'm not going to repeat myself for all the others. We also mentioned Pareto efficiency last week, and we say that Pareto efficiency is a situation where it is impossible to make any one person better off without making at least one person worse off, and that is the definition of Pareto efficiency. We know that a perfectly competitive market's equilibrium is Pareto efficient. So in the previous diagram, the $3 price where we set, that is Pareto efficient because your total surplus, your consumer surplus plus your producer surplus is maximized. That's where it's the greatest. At this point, there's no Pareto improving transaction, which means that there will be no possible transaction that will make anybody better off without making somebody worse off. Where can we find slide 5? Kellen, I don't really know what you're asking per se. Sorry. Sorry. I'll leave it to Trent because I probably didn't get the context. Okay, so Pareto improving transaction. We're also going to talk about that in today's lecture or in today's content. It's a transaction where all parties involved are better off. Everybody is better off if we make that decision, and that's a Pareto improving transaction. I will show you an example of that. We also mentioned that Pareto efficiency only focuses on the efficiency. It doesn't look at equality of resources and opportunity. That is left to the government, and that's what we're going to focus on today. We also talked about the invisible hand. We mentioned that the invisible hand in the long run states that individuals' independent efforts to maximize their gains will generally be beneficial for society and result in the socially optimal allocation of resources. I'm going to do a little bit more about on this particular recap because I didn't fully complete this. So the invisible hand principle is very, very important in economics. The invisible hand says that you basically take people that are going after their own self-interest, those people that only care about being as happy as possible, and they have no social preference, or they don't look out for others, and they're very greedy and selfish, basically. So they go after their surplus, and by doing so I'm not criticizing these people. I'm just saying that the invisible hand says that let's assume that everybody is self-centered and has their own interests at heart. They go after their surplus, and by doing so, we derive at the market equilibrium, which is pareto efficient, and that it is very good for society at that point. Therefore, the invisible hand principle says that if you are in a perfectly competitive market, then letting people do whatever they want, that is best for them will also achieve what is best for them will also achieve the optimal outcome for society as a whole. Now, therefore, the invisible hand principle says that if you are in a perfectly let me go back. So this is not just because the surplus is maximized. It is also a matter of efficiency in technological production. As long as there is a profit, there will be an incentive for new firms to enter the market, to push that supply curve to the right. And when we push that supply curve to the right, we know that price will drop. And that is that the new producers will enter into the market as a result of the profit that existed in that market space. Remember, there is in a perfectly competitive market, all the suppliers have perfect knowledge. So there's no secrets as to how you make yourself more efficient or how you utilize technology better. Everybody knows the secrets of everybody else, and that's one of the assumptions of a perfectly competitive market. But we know that when price decrease, there is then a decrease in profit, and we will end up at a point where the firm's profit, all the total firm's profit is zero. And at this point, then there is no incentive for any more new firms to enter the market. The magic of this process is that by the shift of supply to the right, the price will go down. So it will go down until the price that we're talking about touches the minimum ATC. Okay, this will be the point where there is zero profit. And so the supply curve will stop shifting to the right. There are no further incentives for any more firms to enter the market. However, we are at a very special place here. Firms are making zero profit, therefore, that is good for consumers. So there are two sides to it. But also, at the same time, technologically, it is the lowest production cost possible. The average total cost curve captures the technology, how much firms are spending to produce this good. They're using technology to produce in the most efficient fashion or efficient manner. Okay, and that is great. Now, so in the long run, which is why we talk about the invisible hand, in the long run, price will go down to where price is at minimum ATC. Everyone is making zero profit, so the long run supply curve is also horizontal. So it's a perfectly, we say in the long run supply is more elastic, but if we use a horizontal supply curve, that supply is perfectly elastic. So if demand changes, price does not change, but the quantity does. And in this market is great for consumers. Okay, now that's it for chapter 4. Now going to show my slides for chapter 5. Sorry, I dropped something. Just give me a second. I dropped the pen that I was going to use to annotate. So now we're going to look at government intervention. We're going to then talk about, what are some of the things that the government can do. The first policy that we're going to look at is the policy of price ceiling. Price ceiling, as per the definition, states that it represents a maximum allowable price imposed by the government. Okay, so this is a cap. We're going to put a cap. Now, we're going to put a cap below the market equilibrium price. This happens because the government does this because they believe that the price is unfairly high and they're trying to protect consumers. Okay, I use the word trying because we're going to see the impact of this price ceiling. The government is trying to make a particular product or a particular service more affordable. Okay, trying. Now, I'm not going to use this particular, I'm going to use a blank slide. And we'll come back to this particular slide in a few moments. I'm going to draw demand, supply. Now, I want you, for exam purposes, to learn how to draw this, which is why I'm doing this on a blank screen without any words on it. Now, the first thing that we're going to look at is we're going to find the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now this topic is about price ceiling. So if the price ceiling is above this equilibrium price, that price ceiling is useless because the market will naturally stop at equilibrium where price is at P and quantity is at Q. So your price ceiling, the word ceiling indicates the roof, okay, roof. But we're making that roof low. So when it hits the roof, the price can't go further than that roof. Okay? So we're going to put price here. So this is your price ceiling. Okay? At this price, we find our point on our supply curve and we find our point on our demand curve. This is quantity supplied and this is quantity demanded. This indicates that we have excess demand. Right? Now, before I talk about consumer surplus and producer surplus, we're going to look at a table, and I want you to be able to draw that table in the corner somewhere to help you with your analysis. I'm going to say, okay, before, after. Let's look at what the consumer surplus and the producer surplus looks like. Now, we know that consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the supply curve. So this is your consumer surplus. Okay, like I said, I'm quite consistent. I tend to shade my consumer surplus with yellow and my producer surplus with green. So my producer surplus is the area above the supply curve. So above the supply curve and below the price. So this area is my producer surplus. Okay, I haven't labeled it yet, so just bear with me for the moment. Now, we are going to eventually label all of them. Now, at the price ceiling, will this help the consumers? Is the question that we're going to ask. At the price ceiling, more consumers want to rent apartments. We saw it. Okay? We have more consumers wanting to rent. We have a greater quantity demanded because it is now cheaper. The price has dropped. But quantity supplied has decreased. Why has quantity supplied decreased? Because the people who own the apartments do not like that price ceiling. The rents that the landlord can make is reduced. Therefore, landlords might decide, well, if you imagine you have an apartment, there are some people who buy an apartment, but let's say there's only one person and you bought a 2-bedroom. Let's imagine you manage to find an apartment for yourself and rent it for $300, but you're able to rent out a 2-bedroom for $1,000 near the university. So basically, you manage to rent a 1-bedroom somewhere really far away for $300, and you have an apartment near the university that you can rent it out for $1,000. You're making $800. No, $700. Sorry, my maths. So you are able to make a profit. But if, let's say, rents have then dropped and the cap for rents is now $500, and you go, well, if I add my rent somewhere else for $300 plus my transportation costs plus all the maintenance costs for my apartment, well, that's not really worth it now. So I might decide that I'm going to move in rather than rent it out, or I might sell it. So landlords have that decision that they can make. They could potentially move in themselves or sell the apartment, but the point is that the supply of the apartments would decrease, okay, because of the price ceiling on rents. It is now not worth the suppliers to keep that apartment available for rent. So what happened is the price ceiling might not have gone the way that the governments wanted it to, because they imposed a cap to make it more affordable for people. But actually, they shrunk the supply of the apartments in the economy. And if there was a problem with homelessness before, well, that's not going to solve it, because governments were trying to make it more affordable for people to rent so that there'll be less homeless people. Now, we're not really solving that problem, are we? Because there are less apartments available for rent. So when we look at the graph at price ceiling, we know that quantity demanded is greater than quantity supply and that we have excess demand. Now, the next point that we're going to look at is we look at those 2 points, and we're going to look at the lowest of the 2 points, or also known as the short side of the market. So we're going to look at this quantity supply. So we're going to take that quantity supply line and we're going to draw it upwards. Okay, sorry, it's a little bit skewy. It's not perfectly straight. Bear with me. Now, with that line, that is where you're going to supply. And unfortunately, the people with the highest willingness to buy will be the consumers that will get that product. Okay. So this is the point where I'm going to label my graph. I'm going to say that this box here is A, this is B, C, D, and E. Now, before the price ceiling, at price paid, our consumer surplus is A plus B. Our producer surplus before the price ceiling was C plus D plus E. Okay. After the price ceiling was introduced, the consumer surplus, now we look at who's consuming. Okay, let's just trying to find a different marker. Just bear with me. Okay. Now, the people that have, I'm going to go back and talk about something that we mentioned earlier. Remember, we talked about the rationing rule. We're implicitly now using that rationing rule assumption, where only those with the highest willingness to pay will be the ones that gets the good first. It's very realistic, isn't it? So we're going to say that at this particular point, these are the people with the highest willingness to pay on the demand curve. Okay? They are the only people that will get the good. And they will get it at the price ceiling at the bottom there. Okay? So now we know that that's the box for our new consumer surplus. So after the price ceiling, our consumer surplus is A plus C. Our producer surplus is the point above the supply curve, but below the price. So our producer surplus after is E. Now, my next question. Why are we not demanding here? What happened to that bid above B? Consumers at that point are not going to be serviced. You're not going to get the good because the government has made it so that landlords are not willing to produce apartments for rent beyond QS. So those consumers there are not going to be serviced. They're not going to get the goods. So we've lost them. Okay. Then we talk about the bid under D. That part of the supply curve, remember, I only stopped the supply curve up until the end of sector E. But below the sector D or area D, producers who are less productive are not going to be supplying. So after the government reduced the rents by implementing a price ceiling, you can see the areas of surplus has decreased. But you need to be able to comment in your exam on where it is going. Just drawing that curve, that diagram, is to enable you to analyze what is happening. Where is it going? From producers to consumers, or totally disappearing, or totally lost? This is very, very important because it determines the winner and loser of this type of policy. So let's have a look. What is happening to consumers and producers who are actually managing to exchange the goods after the introduction of this policy? Now, the line above sector A are the consumers with the highest willingness to pay that are going to be able to rent the apartment. Those consumers initially were getting sector A as the consumer surplus. The line below sector E, on the supply line, suppliers that are willing or able to rent out the apartments. The question that we're going to ask is what happens to their surplus? Before the price ceiling, for this group of suppliers, they would be getting sector C and sector E. Forget about D for the moment. At that particular quantity supplied and at price at equilibrium, at price P, they would have gotten sector C and sector E at that initial price. But now, because of the price ceiling, they're only getting sector E. Okay? These consumers getting sector A can get their apartments cheaper. So up to this point, the government is living up to their promises because those high willingness to pay consumers are getting their apartment at a lower price, from price P to price PC. They are getting a better deal. So the government is keeping their promise. Suppliers, on the other hand, are getting a worse deal because the suppliers was originally getting C plus D plus E if at equilibrium price and quantity. But now this C has been transferred to the consumers. This is what we call a transfer surplus or a surplus transfer. Consumers are now getting A plus C. Suppliers are only getting E. Therefore, your suppliers are worse off. Is everybody okay at this point? Now, we're going to then look. Now, I'm assuming everybody's all right because the chat is very quiet, which is good, not a bad thing. Now, we are going to look at what happened to this bit here and this bit here. Sector B and D. Sector B and D are completely lost or disappeared. For Sector B, consumers that are not able to find an apartment after the introduction of the policies, because suppliers are not willing to produce more than what they are producing at QS. That's the maximum they're happy to produce. So consumers at the area B are lost. Lost, gone, whatever word you would like to describe it, disappeared. Suppliers in Sector D are also victims because they are renting their apartments at price P before the policy, but with the price ceiling, they're no longer willing to rent out the apartment at the lower price. Therefore, they're losing their surplus. That's lost as well. These two sectors are what we call dead weight loss. B and D are dead weight loss. They're dead weight loss, and therefore they're not Pareto efficient. They're not maximizing their total surplus. All the other sectors, A, C, and E, are still part of total surplus because consumer surplus is now A and C, and producer surplus is now E. So A, C, and E equals to total surplus, but we have a deadweight loss of area B and area D. And that's why we're not maximizing total surplus and we're not Pareto efficient. Okay. Consumers in Sector B, relatively low willingness to pay. Consumer in Sector A has high willingness to pay. So what am I trying to say? So maybe you can see or say that people in Sector A, maybe the rich, and people in Sector B are less rich or poor. So what this suggests is economic analysis suggests that those with high willingness to pay are also the rich. Therefore, what the government is doing, the government is helping the rich get richer. They're helping the rich appropriate an extra Sector C that wasn't available to the consumers before. Therefore, the rich gets more surplus. And the poor renters are the ones going to be left out of the market. Really wasn't what the government anticipated. Now, going back to deadweight loss. Deadweight loss, actually, I'm going to go back to the slides. Give me a second. So we're going to focus on deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is the loss in the economic surplus due to the market being prevented from reaching equilibrium price and the quantity where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. If we look at a diagram, we talked about demand, we talk about supply. Your demand is your marginal benefit. Your supply is your marginal cost. So what we're trying to achieve here is the equilibrium point. Okay? The equilibrium where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. All right? Now, I mentioned earlier when I was looking at the diagram, I said that the winners of this policy are the consumers with a high reservation price because they have a high willingness to pay and they are the rich. Now, the question then is, what do you think is our solution? If the government really wanted to help the low-income households, a direct lump sum transfer is more effective. What the economists are trying to say is, leave the market alone. Let the market operate at a pareto efficient level where your demand equals your supply. And this is your price, and this is your quantity. We also said that will be your total consumer surplus. That will be your total producer surplus. But this direct lump sum transfer to the poor is a bit like this, saying, we're going to take some money, okay, take a bit of surplus from this section here and giving it to this section here. Okay. Now, price and quantity has not changed. The government has gone into the bank account of the rich people, took some money, and has given it to the poor. I had students actually saying to me, that sounds like robbery. Well, it's sort of like the Robin Hood theory, isn't it? We steal the money from the rich and we give it to the poor. Now, we're going to talk about a different concept a little bit later when we look at taxation and redistribution of funds. But a direct lump sum transfer to the poor would be more efficient, because what we're trying to say is, well, let's leave the market be, because the market is the most efficient at equilibrium price. Let's not muck around with price ceilings. And we can do this in different ways. Okay. Now we've just touched on price ceiling. The next thing that we're going to look at is the price floor. I'm going back to my slide. And I want to create a blank slide. Okay, going to do this again. Now we're going to look at price flow. So we're going to draw And as usual, we're going to look at this is your price, this is your quantity. This is your equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now, a price floor represents a minimum allowable price imposed by the government. This is what the government is trying to do. This is a minimum allowable price. This is when the government believes that price is unfairly low. And they're trying to use this to protect producers in certain sectors. In the past, this was something that was very popular in European governments, where they use price floor to protect their farmers. I don't know whether you guys are old enough to remember the price war in Australia with our dairy farmers only a few years ago, actually. Because I remember that there was a point in time, so I know it's within the last 10 years or maybe even less, because I went to the shops. My son wanted water. And I went to the shop and I go, oh my God, water? A small bottle of water for like, $2.50, unless I want to buy this ginormous Coast brand bottle, which I didn't want to lug around. So a small bottle of water costs like $2.50. And I could have bought a bottle of milk for $1 a liter. And, that's because our government wasn't protecting the farmers, unlike what they were doing in Europe. So let's go back. So it says that, in a price floor, it represents a minimum allowable price. And because we're using it to protect our farmers, this price floor will have to be above our equilibrium price. If it was below our equilibrium price, it wouldn't be effective because it will naturally stop at an even lower price. Okay? So it wouldn't achieve what it was meant to achieve. So it must be above the equilibrium price. And we are going to then look at what happens. At the price floor, we find the point that intersects the demand curve. We find the point that intersects the supply curve. And we find our quantity demand. And we find our quantity supply. Quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. So this is excess supply. And we're producing at this price floor, okay? But we always look at the short side, okay? So we're going to look at the short side of the 2 points. And that's going to be where we're going to supply, because that's where the demand stops at that point. So suppliers might want to produce more, but there isn't demand. So there's no point in producing more up to QS. Okay. What were I going to talk about is I'm going to draw the table. Before, after, consumer surplus, producer surplus. Now we're going to label it first, aren't we? We're going to label our consumer surplus as below the demand curve and above the price. So it's below the demand curve and above the price. And we shade that in yellow. And we're going to shade our producer surplus that is above the supply curve but below the price. And we're going to shade that in green. My goodness, I'm really loving annotating in OneNote rather than the PowerPoint slides. Now, okay, now that we have all our little bits, we're then going to label them. We're going to label A, B, C, D, E. Now, you can label it whatever you like. That's just my labeling, okay? So we know that before the price floor, our consumer surplus is A plus B plus C. Our producer surplus is D plus E. Then we're going to take, okay, at this particular price, these are the people that will high willingness to consume, and so our consumer surplus has now shrunk from A plus B plus C to A. Our producer surplus, producers love it because now the price is higher. And so our producer surplus is going to be the area above the supply curve. We'll stop at where the quantity that we're willing to supply and below the price. So we are going to have all of these, which means that after the price floor, the producers have B plus D. So now you know what we are looking at, right? We know what we're looking at. So we know that this B came from here, and that is called a transfer surplus. Okay. Now, that's the part of the policy that was successful because the surplus got transferred from the consumers to the producers, which is the aim of the policy. Okay. The lucky producers that are able to sell the good can sell it at a higher price. So they are gaining some extra surplus. However, sector C has just disappeared. This area here, trying to find a gloomy color. This area is gone. Why is it gone? Because by changing the price, the government has shrunk the quantity for the good exchange. Having less product or goods in the market means that consumers in sector C are left without a good. The suppliers in sector E suppliers, I can't get any color to show here. The suppliers in sector E are also not going to be able to supply anymore. And as a result of that, we know that these two sectors are what we call dead weight loss. Okay. So sector A, right at the top there, these are your lucky rich customers. They can still afford the good even though the price is high. They can still get that tiny little bit of happiness, which is what we describe consumer surplus. Not as much as before, because before we were happy A plus B plus C. Now we only have happy A section. The lucky farmers, on the other hand, at the price floor, can get sector B, which was a transfer from consumers to producers, plus D. And these are the efficient producers. Efficient producers. Sorry, my my spelling. Producers. Okay, so these are the efficient producers that were able to achieve the producer surplus. Now, this is another example of how the policy did not quite pan out for the government. The government wanted to support the producers. But in the end, the losers in this particular case are both the consumers and the producers. The producers that are left out in sector E, and the consumers that are either left out or ended up paying a higher price in sector B. Sorry, not sector B. In sector A, losing out completely in sector C. And only that little bit of the consumers in the red line, the rich, are able to obtain the goods, but they were paying a much higher price. Okay, so the producers at the bottom of sector D are the winners because they are selling at a higher price. This is not a Pareto improving transaction. Oh, sorry. I repeat, this is not a Pareto improving policy. It is not only making someone worse off, but also killing some of the surplus originally available. So, what is the solution? Let's go back to your lecture notes. Sorry, I'm using two screens, so I'm trying to find the mouse to go to. Yeah, okay, finally. Now we talk about the losers and we talk about consumers and producers, but what is the solution? Okay, that is the key thing that we are asking. The solution is that the losers are willing to compensate the winners in the attempt to get the government to get rid of the price floor. Canceling the price floor. We call that a lobby. We want the whole group to lobby the government to get rid of the price floor. This would be a Pareto improving transaction. Now, how do we do that? Now, remember we say consumer surplus, producer surplus. Now we're saying to the government, we're trying to lobby to the government not to get rid of the price floor. But what exactly does it mean by the losers will be willing to pay the winners the exact amount they gain from the intervention in exchange for cancelling the price floor? So what we're saying is to get the sum of the consumers, the rich who manage to get that area A, well, they're paying a higher price anyway, right? And they are willing and able to pay that higher price. So that sector there. To give it to this group of suppliers. And we're saying that, hey, we're going to compensate you with what you have benefited from this price floor. Can you lobby with us, lobby the government to get rid of the price floor? Okay, this is a Pareto improving transaction because everybody is happy. All right, nobody is worse off. Anybody has questions at this point? It's been very quiet, the chat. I'm hoping that's because, it's so clear that there is no need for questions, which is great. But if you do, the chat is there to help you. Okay, now this is the introduction to price ceiling and price floor, the two policies that we've just talked about that might be well-intentioned, but they did not really deliver. They ended up favoring a very small part of the population and creating some debt loss for society. As a result of that, that's not the smartest idea. But yet you're going to see the governments all over the world, Australia and around the world, do this over and over and over again. I think the smartest politician or the best politicians probably have studied economics. Okay? Or they should, or should I say, we should all send our politicians to do economics 101. Okay? Or 1101. Because, they need to know the basics. Now, I'm going to finish off today's lecture with the concept of taxation. Okay? Something that is an intervention by the government as well. Now, unlike price ceiling and price floor, a tax generates tax revenues. We know that a tax revenue, actually, I'll wait till I get I use the graph before I talk about tax revenue. But a tax revenue redistributes wealth within the society. Okay? It improves the distribution of income and opportunities across different population groups. So the question that we're going to ask ourselves is taxation going to work better than price ceiling and price floor? We're going to see that in a minute. Everything we will be talking about here applies to a perfectly competitive market. Okay, please remember that. Perfect competition. Now, we started off with a demand curve and a supply curve. And let me label this as P. This is your equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Or you can put QE and PE, but P is fine. Yeah. Now, let's imagine, okay? I'll give you an assumption here. Example, let's say our marginal cost is $1. Let's say our tax is $1. So with the tax will move upwards. At every point in time, every additional unit that you produce, you have to add a tax to your supply curve. So that tax is added at every single unit. So your true marginal cost or your new marginal cost equals $1, which is my cost of production per unit, plus tax. Because tax in this case is $1, your marginal cost is $2. What that means is that it inflates the cost of production. From a producer's perspective, producing this extra good, unit of good, costs $2. So you are really not more inefficient, but the price has gone up. And what this tax is that the government has created an illusion. I use the word illusion because it seems like this magical number that suddenly increased. It's an illusion that the cost of production has gone up. It hasn't. Okay? But when your when your tax is imposed, you can either say that supply shifts upwards or supply shifts to the left. Ultimately, it is increased by the amount of the tax. Okay, so let's have a look at this. See PE? Then we look at this point. This point is your supply with the tax component. So this is P tax. And I can't remember. I was going to say something. I was going to do something. So this is the quantity that we're going to produce at the point where we included the tax. Okay. So if we look at this point here, maybe I should use a green, this point here. See how this is tax? So at this point, this must be P tax minus tax. Okay, so P tax minus tax is the cost of your goods without the tax. P tax is the cost of the goods plus the tax amount. So if we go back to what I was talking to you about before, where marginal cost is $1, your tax is $1, and the new illusion is $2. So it costs you $1 to produce something. This is your real, fundamental, reality-based cost. Because the tax of $1 doesn't actually have any real reason to exist, except that it's man-made. The government imposed it, okay? Man-made by the government. So the tax component increased your cost, but it doesn't change your fundamental production cost. Now I'm going to color in and look at the areas. Okay, so we said before that the consumer surplus before the tax, okay, we'll talk about before tax and after tax. consumer surplus and producer surplus. Okay. Now we are going to produce at P-tax. So that is your quantity. Now your consumer surplus before the tax refuse to let me do that. I'm going to go back to what I know is here. Okay, sorry. OneNote is a lot better. We deal with it and do what I can. So this is your consumer surplus. Okay, then we go back to producer surplus. We say it's supply curve above the supply curve but below the price. So at above the supply curve, below the price. So that is your producer surplus. Okay, don't forget this is the point where we are supplying. Okay. Now, what we then talk about, now all my lines are a little bit off, so just forgive me there. I'm going to redraw some of the lines there, because otherwise you can't see what I'm doing. Okay. Then we're going to label. We're going to say that this is A. I don't know why the reaction is so slow. This is A. My goodness, I am just going to use, let me see if I can use OneNote. It'll be an easier option, new section. It'll be quicker rather than muck around with that. Demand, supply, so that's my equilibrium price and quantity. And then we have a tax component. Actually, that's a terrible drawing. Let me see if I can actually erase that. Perfect. S equals MC plus tax. This is S equals MC. So we know that before the tax is implemented, our consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price. So that's our consumer surplus. Our producer surplus is the area above the price, area above the supply curve and below the price. That's our producer surplus. And now we have tax. So we include the tax amount, which is here at this P tax and Q tax. And we know that at this particular point, this is P tax minus your tax amount, which in our earlier example, I assumed that it was 1. Okay, but rather than saying P tax minus 1, I prefer to say P tax minus tax because tax could change. Now we know that this here in this thickened line, that's your tax amount. Okay, so P tax is what consumers pay, but not what producers actually earn. Okay, so this is what consumers pay. P tax minus tax is the price that suppliers are really receiving. So when we draw out the table and we say before and after, consumer surplus, producer surplus, and we're going to label it A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay. Now, before the tax, consumer surplus was A plus B plus C. Producer surplus was D plus E plus F. Okay, so that's consumer surplus and producer surplus. Let's have a look at what happens with this tax. With the tax, this is our price. So the area below the demand curve and above our price, that's area A. For the suppliers, it is the area above your supply curve, but we're going to only receive up until P tax minus tax, and below our price, and therefore that's F. So clearly you can see here, this is gone, this is gone. We've lost a lot. Consumers are consuming less at a higher price, they lost B and C. Producers are producing less at a lower price, and they lost D and E. There is a saving grace though. The only saving grace here is that different from price ceiling and price floor, a tax generates tax revenue. So when we say tax revenue equals tax per unit multiplied by the quantity Q tax here. And this goes to the government. And the government we then talk about redistribution of profit. So this area here, B and D, that area there is not a deadweight loss. That's a transfer surplus, not to consumer or to producer. That's a transfer surplus. That's a transfer surplus to the government. The only area of deadweight loss, is this one here. C and E are deadweight loss. Okay, so C plus E is a deadweight loss. So sector C are people who are less rich, they are poor consumers, they're not consuming anymore. Sector E, they are less efficient or inefficient producers, they are no longer producing, and therefore they also lose all their surplus. So to sum up, when the government imposes a tax from the perspective of the producer, it is as if their production cost has increased. Like I said, an illusion. It's more expensive to produce the goods, so the supply curve shifts to the left. Therefore, we produce less. Some consumers are left out. They're bad for both consumers and producers. However, the government is making a tax revenue. that tax revenue can be redistributed in the economy. It is good. It is therefore good. But it is still reducing it is still reducing fundamentally the quantity traded in the market. And therefore, from a society perspective, this is still not good. There's still no good reason why we should reduce quantity for this good. People loved the good and was having fun consuming the good, but now they're going to have less of it. Not because the technology has changed or it's more costly to produce. It is just the illusion of this cost inflation that is generated by the tax. Because it is not a fundamental change because of preferences or production technology. It is just man-made. The government decided to put a tax on it. And it creates a distortion in the quantity traded that does not have a fundamental reality, and therefore creating a deadweight loss. Who are the losers in the policy? Let me go back to your lecture slides. Who are the losers in the policy? The losers are the consumers and the producers, because your price increase, your quantity decrease. Now, I'm not going to talk about this bit today. I'm going to start with this bit next week. The winner, of course, is the government. They get the tax revenue. And they're saying that what is the solution? The solution will be that the losers will be willing to pay the winners the exact amount it gained from the intervention in exchange for cancelling the tax. So we're trying to transfer the tax revenue of the government in exchange for eliminating the tax. And that will be a Pareto improving transaction. Now, I know that I've got 3 minutes left, but I do want to give you an example. Hypothetically, okay? I think without an example, it's a little bit hard to understand. Hypothetically, government tax sugary drinks. I don't know whether coffee counts. I'm not going to sell coffee. Let's say sugary drinks, okay? To fund health programs. So the government puts this tax to fund health programs. So the government gives $100 million to health advocates, and they are the winners. And they gain $100 million in funding to try and educate people not to drink Coca-Cola or Pepsi or lemonade or orange soda or whatever it might be. But we just said that the consumers and producers are losers and that they lost, hypothetically, $150 million in reduced sales and enjoyment, yada, yada, yada. Let's say that the losers, our consumers and producers, take $100 million and give it to the health advocates to run their program to educate people to drink less soft drinks. And we lobby the government on both sides to cancel the tax on sugary drinks. That would be a Pareto improving transaction. And both sides agree, because the producers, you might think, well, why would the producers do that? Well, they were losing $150 million. By doing that, giving the $100 million to funding, they're doing some good, but they're losing $50 million less. The health advocates are happy, they're winners. The consumers and producers are losing $50 million less, and they're winners as well. So that's a Pareto improving transaction. Yeah. All right, I'll continue with elasticity of that in the losers sector next time. Thank you very much for today. I'm so sorry I went right up to 12:30. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, Trent and I are still here for a few more minutes. All right, guys, I will see you all on Thursday with the rest of government intervention and hopefully talk about international trade and finishing that as well. Fingers crossed. Bye, guys. So lovely to have you all. See ya. See you on Thursday. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Venetia. Bye, everyone. Thank you, Ariane, for your question.